This is your Daily Detroit for Tuesday, June 9th, 2020. I'm Sven Gustafson.
And I'm Jer Stays. On today's show, there are new guidelines for reopening Detroit's casinos whenever that happens. Museums are staying closed. A new poll shows Michigan's teacher shortage is about to get way worse.
Detroit City FC will have some kind of a season. A Trump boat parade is coming, and I report from a mass protest in Ferndale. Let's get started.
First, the latest on the coronavirus, which is no longer gripping Michigan quite as hard as other states. There were just 129 new cases in Michigan and 17 COVID-19 fatalities on Monday. That brings the confirmed case total to nearly 59,000 and the death total over 5,600. It'll be interesting to see what happens after the partial reopening today. Other states generally have had a spike of cases and deaths in their data 2 to 3 weeks afterward.
Wear your masks, everyone.
Even if you don't frequent the Detroit casinos yourself, they play a crucial role in funding the city of Detroit, and they employ thousands of people. So as things start to open up, it's important to ask, what about Greektown, MGM, and Motor City? They've been closed since March. Well, we don't have a reopening date yet, but there is new insight on how casinos might look when they reopen from the Michigan Gaming Control Board. Casinos will be allowed to use 15% of their legal capacity, and there will be temperature checks and fewer entry points to the facility. Smoking will now be banned on casino floors, there will be no poker rooms, and social distancing will have to be enforced. Additionally, there will be more cleaning. Casinos needed to propose reopening plans to the executive director of the Gaming Control Board, and they also said that they consulted with unions. The oversight group says that they considered CDC recommendations, Nevada Gaming Board guidelines, and those from the National Indian Gaming Commission.
Now on to museums. Although the state now says they can open, a number of local museums are remaining shuttered. The Henry Ford and associated attractions like Greenfield Village in Dearborn are staying closed through June 28th. The Freep reports that the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, MoCAD, and many other museums don't yet have opening dates. We'll put a link to that story in the show notes. On the hyper-local level, things vary from city to city. We now have word that the public library in Oak Park will reopen for curbside service on June 22nd, but you still can't go inside. Likewise, the Ferndale Area District Library starts curbside pickup next Monday. That's June 15th. Royal Oak, meanwhile, has reopened its public playgrounds, as have a number of other cities.
A new poll from the Michigan Education Association is setting off alarm bells among policymakers and school district leaders. For context, even before the novel coronavirus, schools were facing a teacher shortage, and it may be about to get much worse. The survey of 15,000 teachers by the union says that nearly a third of Michigan's K-12 teachers are out the door or on their way out the door. The poll says that around 7% of Michigan educators are leaving the profession because of their concerns around the virus, and 24% are seriously thinking about it. Only about a quarter of teachers think it's possible to return to classes as normal in school buildings in the fall. 8 in 10 teachers say they worry about the health risks to their families if they return to in-person teaching, and 9 in 10 fear for the health of fellow teachers, administrators, and support staff, and finally 86% had fears for their students. The survey was done over a week starting May 15th.
Well, these are not hopeful findings, I guess, for those of us who have kids in schools.
I mean, it seems like, Sven, that the arrows are pointing towards education being a mess the next year, as budget cuts seem to be coming. We've been following the story for a while. There is no movement in Washington, D.C. around getting more money for local states, districts, all that kind of stuff. And from what I've been able to gather on the ground, calling a few folks, is that you can't plan on wishes and hopes. You've got to plan on reality. And the reality so far is the clock is ticking. We are running out of time, and it's looking like there is not going to be a rescue from D.C.
Yeah, and I sure hope that politicians come to their senses and change that. But yeah, I mean, we're looking at a fall reopening. I mean, I won't even get into how it's going to look like, whether they're going to have any in-building instruction at all, or if it's going to be some kind of a mix. I'll leave that, till another time. But without a fix from the federal government because of the economic slowdown from the coronavirus, sales tax revenue, which funds K through 12 public education in Michigan, is going to be way down. That means huge budget cuts. That means fewer teachers, larger class sizes, less instructional materials. I mean, this is not good coming on the heels of what happened this year and what's still going on my kids are in their last week of school right now. We've had 3 months now of in-home digital instruction, which, you know, frankly has been kind of a crapshoot. I mean, my kids are certainly burned out on it, and my wife's burned on it, trying to get them to stay on top of things and keeping them focused. There have been stories written about how this is hurting lots of disadvantaged students who don't have necessarily internet signals or computers at home and everything like that. And coupled with that, we're looking at, some serious disruption to the educational development of children. And I think it's a huge problem. And I don't understand why this is not more of an urgent issue in Washington, D.C.
Well, one of my concerns, too, is there are a lot of people who are relying on schools basically as a place to watch their kids. I mean, yes, the education part is primary and important, but there are a lot of people who aren't going to be able to work or work as much unless there is school support for their kids.
True. Well, what was supposed to be a big year for Detroit City FC in its first full season as a professional soccer club has been complicated by the coronavirus. That has essentially put the kibosh on the men's spring season. It's also complicated the inaugural season for the new DCFC women's team, which was supposed to have started play last month. Now, the club and the National Independent Soccer Association have announced the format for the fall season. It kicks off August 8th. The 8 teams will be divided into Eastern and Western conferences, with each team playing a home and away match against each member of its conference. An overall league champion will be determined later at a single location tournament to be held in late October. It's not yet clear whether fans will be allowed in to watch the matches. The club says that will depend on permission from state and local health authorities and the judgments of the clubs themselves. More details are expected soon regarding the schedules, including preseason and exhibition matches, and the options for season ticket holders. City also says it's working with the United Women's Soccer League to establish a format for a 2020 women's season. Details are expected soon on that.
Sven, personally, I'm pretty excited about this.
It'll be good to have some kind of real-life sports ball in this town, that's for sure.
I mean, I'd even watch a live stream at this point.
Oh, for sure.
Donald Trump turned 74 on Sunday, and local supporters of the president plan a boat parade in celebration. The Michigan MAGA Boat Parade is planned to kick off Saturday afternoon at a marina in Harrison Township on Lake St. Clair and wrap up at 4 p.m. near the Ambassador Bridge on the Detroit River. Participating boats are expected to be decorated with American flags or Trump signs. A parade of vehicles is expected to also follow the route on land using Jefferson Avenue. The event is being organized via Facebook by the Michigan Conservative Coalition and the group Michigan Trump Republicans 2020. As we record this, nearly 800 people had responded that they planned to attend.
All right, Jared. Well, the listener will not know that it took us about 25 takes to get through this without laughing. But I mean, because this is some next level absurd.
Scroll to the end of the show.
I'm just struck by how bizarre this is. Like, who celebrates like a living president in office's birthday? I mean, I struggle to imagine people putting together a boat parade for, say, Barack Obama's birthday.
I'm sure people did celebrate birthdays and maybe did the Stevie Wonder happy birthday for Barack Obama, but this is a next
parade?
level. Yeah, a boat parade is a whole nother thing. I mean, I can't even. I mean, I really thought, I looked at this story and I literally thought it was The Onion. I thought you were like poning me here in the script.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I suppose this might be a good opportunity to do a tab of acid and go out and watch the riverfront on Saturday afternoon. I don't know. But it's also really interesting timing, I guess, given the really dismal polls that have been coming out about the president and, kind of measuring the country's view of how he's handling these multiple crises. Jeff Guerin is a liberal pollster, and he dumped a bunch of polling data from a nationwide poll that he did on Twitter on Monday. And there's some really eye-popping details here. He found that 60% of respondents disapprove of how Trump is dealing with the unrest, all the protests and everything, including 69% of independents and 20% of Republicans. That latter figure is significant. 64% against 36% say that Trump is doing more to exacerbate and worsen tensions than he is to ease the tensions. And that includes 30% of Republican respondents who criticize him for that. Meanwhile, 63% said both that the president is doing too little to address the mistreatment of black people at the hands of police and that he encourages that mistreatment. And then finally, this one's really remarkable. 59% said that Trump lacks compassion and empathy for other people's problems. And only 26% said that he actually cares about the average person.
But didn't you see him in front of a church with a Bible? He must care.
Oh, yeah.
That was a powerful walk, sir.
Yes. Yeah.
You might say it brought some people to tears.
You might. We're going to talk about that on this show later this week, I understand. About tear gas.
We are actually. I have lined up a number of doctors around the dangers of tear gas, pepper spray, and rubber bullets. Speaking of the things out there in the world, the Detroit protests have gotten a ton of media coverage, but a lot of activists and others will talk about the idea that it's the suburbs where a lot of change needs to happen. Metro Detroit has a very deep history steeped in racism and racist policies, especially between suburban borders and the city, things like that. So I thought it was interesting, Sven, that you actually hit up the Ferndale protests this weekend.
That's right. I was actually out visiting with my parents on Saturday afternoon, and I didn't really, to be honest with you, know much about what was planned in Ferndale. I happened to, on my way back, I met my family up at Geary Park in Ferndale. My kids were at the skate park there, which just reopened just recently. When all of a sudden, this huge crowd of protesters marches right into the park. They're carrying Black Lives Matter signs and all kinds of other signs. They're chanting things like, "I can't breathe," and "hands up, don't shoot," and so forth. Police would later tell me they estimated there were between 1,500 and 2,000 people who took part in the march from the police station and by City Hall to Geary Park. When they arrived in the park, they gathered and formed a large circle in a grassy field. There was a woman, black woman, I didn't catch her name. She spoke about how the mostly white crowd who had gathered could help black people. She at one point said, "Put your white privileges aside and support us." She talked a lot about supporting black-owned businesses. And there were also calls, frankly, to defund the police, which obviously is a controversial notion among some. I will point out that I was seated directly behind Ferndale's police chief, Vincent Palazzolo, and another officer. They followed the cues of the rest of the crowd and knelt as the people spoke in the middle of the circle. Later on, they sort of changed and speakers moved under a picnic shelter. I didn't hear every speaker, but there was a woman there who talked about, she was a Detroit resident, actually, who she said she lived just a little ways south of 8 Mile. She talked a lot about 8 Mile as sort of the region's metaphorical dividing line between city and suburb, black and white, so forth. And she kind of had some harsh words for Ferndale, I think. She said, as a Detroiter, she loves Ferndale because she's been, for years coming up to do a lot of shopping in the city. And I will say, just as a Ferndale resident, that's a common thing. I mean, there are a lot of black Detroiters who come up to 9 Mile to take advantage of the retail district there because, there are markets more readily available to them than in Detroit.
Well, and there's also a lot of Detroit neighborhoods right next to Ferndale. I used to live in the University District. You've got Palmer Woods, Avenue of Fashion, all that stuff. And to be honest, downtown Ferndale is way easier to get to than downtown or midtown Detroit from that part of town.
Sure. So the woman talked about how she loves Ferndale, does all the shopping there, but she sometimes finds it unwelcoming. And she used the term sundown town. And she cited a lot of statistics that showed how police in a lot of the mostly white suburbs lining 8 Mile Road, like Ferndale, pull over black motorists at much higher rates than white motorists.
That pulling over of more black motorists, although historically it's tied to cities like Warren and Macomb County cities, but also Oakland County as well. And
Hmm.
it is an issue. But sundown town is an interesting topic, and it's important to talk about for a half second because there were a lot of suburbs where black people and other people of color were just not allowed after sundown, in case you didn't know what that is. And that was a real policy for a long time. And I mean, look, I grew up on the east side, even into the 90s and 2000s. Grosse Pointe had issues around that kind of stuff too. I mean, there used to be a police call that you could hear on scanners called Nomad, and you can know the N-word, and then on Mac after dark.
Mm.
And that's a real thing. And I mean, that's something that all of us who grew up around that time knew was a real thing.
Hmm. So the speakers talked about the need for police in Ferndale to be more conscientious and aware. The department should hire more black police officers. I don't think that there are any black police officers in Ferndale at present. If I'm wrong about that, I welcome the correction, but I think I'm correct. In fact, there's a federal lawsuit that, as far as I know, is still active by a retired Ferndale police captain who alleged that the former chief, Wilson, did not want his successor to be African American, which is a charge that Timothy Collins, the former police chief, denies. And I will just point out here, Jer, that the protesters this was in Ferndale, which is, less than 10% black by population. So the protesters were mostly white. But frankly, that mirrors what we've seen in a lot of these protests in Detroit and in other cities around the country, frankly, which I find telling, because these protests are spiraling far beyond, just kind of the usual core political activist protester types. This is becoming, I think, something much more sustainable, and people are feeling exhausted and fed up, and they are taking to the streets. Like, I think that this is, so far anyways, has the sign of something much more sustainable than your average sort of one-day flare-up of a protest. I mean, I was watching TV news last night, my wife and I were, and there was a story from, I think, Bristol City in England, if I remember correctly, where protesters knocked down a statue in a town square of a former slave trader and dragged it all the way to the harbor and dumped it in the water. I mean, this is in England. It's just like remarkable.
Well, it's definitely gone global. And, here in Detroit, you've got more than 10 days of protests. Just got word, actually, that they've ended the curfew in the city, which is good news. And I think about a podcast I heard about over the weekend. I listened to over the weekend. It had Ta-Nehisi Coates in it. And he made a great point that he's more hopeful now. And he feels more hopeful about what's happening now. Because of all the things and all the people that are showing up to the table. And I mean, it's something where if you're going to get change, you need a wide base. And it's definitely a wider base than it's ever been before. Before we let you go, I wanted to give a shout out. We both did. In fact, the whole team really wanted to, because there is a small restaurant that's near Cheyenne and Sven that turned out to be very tasty. And we're always trying to give different recommendations. We've done that on social media, everywhere else, places that maybe you haven't thought about trying. Maybe you see it in an app. Maybe you've driven by it, but maybe you should really give it a shot. Sven, the table is yours.
Sure. So Saturday night, actually, this was right after the protest. We left the protest. We went over to Buena Fe, which is in a tiny little strip mall on 9 Mile in Oak Park, just kind of over the border from Ferndale. Real easy place to miss. It has a Salvadoran and Mexican food menu, and a really small place, very modest, opened, I think, last year or so. And I don't think it's ever really had a really vigorous business. I know I remember talking to the owner last year, and he said things were slow and it's been a struggle and everything. But I got to say, highly worth it. We had a really, really good meal there. On Saturday, my kids were raving about their tacos. My wife loved her enchiladas. I got the pupusas from the Salvadoran menu. They were also delicious.
Pupusas.
So, definitely a great place worthy of, your dollars. And yeah, check them out. It's on 9 Mile and easy place to miss, but definitely worth stopping in.
And we'll put a link in the show notes. All right, that'll do it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening. We made it through another one, Sven.
Yes, we did.
Well, for everyone behind the scenes, and of course, our members on Patreon, of which we picked up a couple more this weekend. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, SJ and Dave. With that, I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. Take care of each other, and we will get through this together.
Donald Trump turned 74 on Sunday, and local supporters of the president plan a boat parade in celebration. Oh my God, that's so absurd. Okay, let's try this again. The beautiful boats.